very much for that introduction. And thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry I can't be there. Like Elena, I found the kind of aims, the description of the aims of the conference enormously interesting, and I am going to try to address links between participation, the popular, and quantification. It's, as usual, I'm afraid, rather a dense paper, but I am going to attempt to share a screen that I hope will provide some pictures anyway. Okay? All right, I'm assuming that's okay. So, a while ago, my niece posted a photo of a takeaway coffee cup with her name on it on Instagram. Her name was misspelt. Her followers were asked to vote as to whether she should adopt the new spelling. When I spoke to her shortly afterwards, she observed that she has a friend who has a Starbucks name. That is the name the friend gives when asked for her name in Starbucks franchises. Another of her friends apparently says his name is My Drink, which my niece described as a bit mean. A friend of mine says that she gives the name of the person asking her, the name, that is, that the employee is required to display as part of their uniform. I just managed to stop myself doing that recently when I was asked for my name. The woman who asked wasn't wearing a name badge, but an apron with the restaurant chain name on it. In a different food chain, my daughter says that customers are required to give orders via an iPad and are automatically given the name of a celebrity. She says she would prefer to be given a number. So I start with this everyday example to foreground what is common knowledge, that naming is socially significant as a mechanism for the identification of persons. And as such, it's routinely subverted in practices of misrepresentation, anonymization, subterfuge, and impersonation. I want to start with that, but I want to go on to consider entities which are identified in the use of pronouns, as well as or instead of names. And the examples that I'm going to discuss are the organization which is named Not in Our Name, and the hashtags Je suis Charlie and Me Too. And I'm going to suggest that these examples can be understood as instances of what might be called an ideology, and I'll go back a slide, an ideology of personalism. As my title indicates, Hey You, in developing this argument, I draw on Louis Althusser's formulation of the role of ideology in constituting individuals as subjects. Althusser gives the example of the hello on a street, and he describes this as one of the rituals of ideological recognition that guarantee for us that we are indeed concrete, individual, distinguishable, and naturally irreplaceable subjects. Through interpolation, individuals, he says, are turned into subjects. Althusser's specific example is the hail from a police officer. Hey, you there. He continues, assuming that the theoretical scene I have imagined takes place in the street, the hailed individual will turn round. By this mere 180-degree physical conversion, he becomes a subject. In Althusser's example, the hailer is a representative of the state, although as many women, maybe others, will know it's not always the state who calls out, hey you, to people on the street. And in this paper, I'm going to suggest that the ideology of personalism is associated with the quantification of participation that emerges in the making of what I and my collaborators in a project on personalisation called People Like You. We think this quantification of participation can be described as a kind of new political arithmetic. And we're developing a sort of overall argument addressing changing relations between economy, politics, and society. But I want to focus here in this paper on how the new political arithmetic deploys pronouns, with a particular focus on the explicit or implicit address to you that Elena mentioned, and on the calculative configuration of relations between I and we, the singular and the plural, the one and the many. But before I do that, I'm going to say a bit more about pronouns. And this is the very dense bit for which I ask your forgiveness in advance. You're not necessarily going to have to follow it all, but I'm trying to introduce some of the approaches to pronouns that I'm going to employ in my analysis. So, pronouns. I want to begin with Emile Benveniste, since he explicitly addresses the role of pronouns in relation to the category of person, arguing that pronouns enable persons to be established in relation to the act of speaking. He describes the referential relationship the pronoun creates as circular. It refers to something when it's used, and what it refers to is this use itself. This is I saying I. Benveniste further proposes that only first and second person pronouns, I and you in English, are truly personal pronouns. So he says, I designates the one who speaks, and at the same time implies an utterance about I. In saying I cannot not be speaking of myself. In the second person, this is still Benveniste, in the second person, you is necessarily designated by I and cannot be thought of outside a situation set up by starting with I. And at the same time, I states something as the predicate of you. But in the third person, in English he or she, a predicate is really stated, only it is outside I, you. This form is thus an exception to the relationship by which I and you are specified. Consequently, the legitimacy of this form as a person is to be questioned. For Benveniste, first and second person pronouns are further uniquely characterized by their oneness. He says, the I who states, the you to whom I addresses himself are unique each time, but he can be an infinite number of subjects or none. For Benveniste, the uniqueness or oneness inherent in the I as a pronoun means there can be no genuine plural form of the first person. So instead, he describes we as a junction between I and the non-I, in which I is dominant or transcendent. This is what I got here. This junction of I and non-I forms a new totality, which is of a very special type, whose components are not equivalent. In we, it is always I which predominates, since there cannot be we except by starting with I, and this I dominates the non-I element. The presence of I is constitutive of we. And he distinguishes between what he calls the undifferentiated we of Indo-European languages and the two distinct forms present in some Indian, Australian, and other languages. I plus you, one form, and another form, I plus they. So in a related strand of thinking on pronouns, the linguist Roman Jakobson describes personal pronouns as shifters. That is, words whose reference, what they refer to, shifts in its use. In his analysis of pronouns, Jakobson is actually especially concerned with the first person plural, we, the collective subject of which he, like Benveniste, recognizes to be uncertain. To formalize a way to understand this uncertainty, he develops a distinctive approach that makes use of cybernetics and information theory to emphasize the importance of relations between a message and its underlying code. And this enables him to introduce two general distinctions, one between language and that which refers, and code, between language and code. And then he introduces the distinctions between four items: narrated event, speech event, a participant of the narrated event, and a participant of the speech event. I'm going to introduce one other approach to pronouns, that of the literary critic, John Froe, who makes a number of important points, saying that in both speech and writing, their pronouns establish a reference point in time. But in writing, that reference point is not necessarily equivalent to the time of enunciation. He's very interested in free indirect discourse, which he describes as combining personal and impersonal narrative modes. And he says that it's possible to identify what he calls a narrating instance that combines impersonal and a personal perspective. And this, he says, is what characterizes free indirect discourse. And I've just given you this long quote from him because I think it's rather wonderful, ending the passage through the empty places of the pronouns and the persons of the verb is something like a journey through non-being, a constitution of the subject in the experience of absence. The pronoun system, like the characters who occupy it, guarantees identity and the dispersal of identity in the same articulation. So hopefully you will hold some of that in your head. I'm going to refer back to it, so don't worry. And I'm going to move on to the examples now. So my first example, if you remember, is the organization called Not in Our Name. It was the name of a US organization founded in 2002 to protest the US government's response to the events of September 11, 2001. It has a statement of conscience calling on the people of the US to resist the policies and overall political direction that emerged in the US following September 11. The organization was disbanded in 2008. That phrase, not in our name, not in my name, was adopted as a slogan as part of public demonstrations in the UK and I think elsewhere to protest the involvement of the UK and other governments in the war against Iraq in 2003. So in this use, not in our name, the capacity for the pronoun our to act as a shifter is muted by its containment as part of the name of a collective organization that has a conscience. And the propriety of the name, not in our name, is secured through the ways in which membership is accomplished by signature. So it's constituted through membership of signatures of individual persons. Signatures are a way to indicate a unique individual whose persistent existence, continuous across time and space, independent of context, is legally recognized. It's used, for example, in contracts. The figure of speech that is composed in this example of the use of a pronoun is thus a properly circumscribed collective entity made of many unique I's or ones, proper individuals. The existence and identity of the collective identity and the singular individuals who comprise the entity are understood to be independent of each other, only temporarily sutured by signatures and the capitalized name, not in our name. But while its capacity to be a shifter, is restricted, attention to the use of the pronoun our might encourage us to see that the circular logic of identification involved here relies upon a short-circuiting. It's the political and legal authority of the state, including apparatus of naming, registers of birth, marriage, death, laws of forgery, impersonation, that allow signatures to be used as legitimate identifiers of both individuals and organizations. In other words, it's the state apparatus that gives legitimacy and political efficacy to the address made by this simultaneously singular and plural entity to government. And what I want to suggest is that this address makes use of an arithmetic in which unified, unique, context-independent ones can be added up to make a many. And that many, the organization can in turn become a one, the organization, with that one being unified, unique, and context-independent of other organizations or ones. But when the words "not in our name" are not used as names, but are statements of conscience appearing on a placard carried by someone at a demonstration, the entity to which my or our refers shifts. So we might rely on the symbolic convention that the person holding a placard intends or motivates the meaning of the statement on the placard. The I who speaks is not given a unique fixed identity and is not accorded a prior or future existence. So when "not in my name" is inscribed as a statement on a placard that moves from one person to another and no name is given, the personal pronoun references a transient individual among other individuals, a not quite proper person. The individuals, if or when they carry the placard, are individuated, but they are identified not in their uniqueness, but in equivalence or sameness. As the placard moves from person to person, my "not in my name" has the same standing as your "not in my name." So the meaning of the words on the placard isn't tied to the identification of you or me as a unique context-independent individual, but to our mutual indication, a pointing out as an individual member of a context-specific, inclusive we of one among other ones. Making a we that is an I plus you, I'm suggesting, is one of the ways in which the solidarity of this figure of speech is given substance, even if it might lose form, as when it becomes a crowd in which I plus you becomes I plus they. So my next example is the hashtag Je suis Charlie, which you probably know this emerged on Twitter 2015 following an attack by gunmen at the offices of the French satirical magazine. 2 days after the event, the hashtag had been used over 5 million times on Twitter, making it one of the most popular topics in the platform's history. It was soon joined by Nous sommes tous Charlie. Most users of these initially French language hashtags were not from French accounts. Immediately following their appearance, another appeared, Je ne suis pas Charlie, although in much smaller numbers. Other hashtags included Je suis Ahmed, in reference to the police officer who was shot outside the offices. Later that year, 2015, Willem, one of the cartoonists employed at the magazine, declared, we vomit on those who suddenly declared that they were our friends. So in the use of the hashtag Je suis Charlie, the use of a name alongside the pronoun je does not restrict its capacity to act as a shifter. So while the word Charlie was usually capitalized as a proper name, it wasn't functioning properly. It was possible to infer that the I in this figure of speech was not an employee or representative of the magazine. In fact, it became increasingly clear that the fact that the hashtag user who says I am Charlie was not a member of the magazine Charlie Hebdo was that was the point, became increasingly clear. But while I earlier gave numbers that attest to the popularity of the hashtag, there was uncertainty about the collective nature of the subject of the hashtag. So one commentator argues that the contagious complexity of the slogan cannot be captured by a quantitative measure of tweet volume and frequency. Nevertheless, he suggested that the hashtag was a mass demonstration of individualized solidarity. Another commentator argues Je suis Charlie functions as a non- or post-human agent that tells the story on the behalf of we, the assemblage. Using Charlie as we does not only define the action and experience, but the narration itself. My suggestion here is that this figure of speech, hashtag Je suis Charlie, is not composed as a collective entity of unique independent ones, or even of one among other ones, but as more and less than one. And I think as such, it's not surprising that as the hashtag grew in popularity, it elicited a critical response from others. And I've got more to say about that, but in the interest of time, I will skip over this. But one of the issues that I think comes from the dispute between Je suis Charlie and Je ne suis pas Charlie comes to do with whether you can participate in an event without being a part of it. So that the kind of what it means to participate, you can participate in an event, but that doesn't mean that you are a part of it necessarily. So Willem saying he vomited on those who said they wanted to be friends was an indication that he thought that you couldn't participate in the event by participating in a speech event concerning the narrative event. So I think the question of whether and how participating in and being part of comes about is a really significant factor in whether and how we talk about the popularity of such figures. So my third example is Me Too, which once again, I imagine you know something about, movement against sexual harassment and assault. Tarana Burke, US social activist, community organizer, began using the phrase in 2006, but the hashtag #MeToo spread online in October 2017, following sexual misconduct allegations against Harvey Weinstein. The hashtag first tweeted around noon on October 15th, 2017, and had been used more than 200,000 times by the end of the day, and tweeted more than 500,000 times by the next day. On Facebook, the hashtag was used by more than 4.7 million people in 12 million posts during the first 24 hours. The platform reported that 45% of users in the US had a friend who had posted using the term. So in this example, as in Je suis Charlie, the relation between the individual and the collective, the singular, the plural, the one and the many, is continually being remade by the platforms in which it moves. And like Je suis Charlie, the example demonstrates that disbelief, doubt, and speculation are the almost unavoidable outcome of the kind of serial calibration of signal, noise, interference, uncertainty across context. Like also Je suis Charlie, MeToo triggered other tangential or derivative claims. Not me too, him too, not all men, yes, all women, believe all women. And it also triggered a series of legal trials in which the relation of personal pronouns to individuals who can be and sometimes are named was put to the test. And in those kinds of contexts, the question becomes, which I is the subject of me too? Is it a one? And then is the I or one of me too telling the truth? And how would you know? And I want to suggest it's not necessarily helpful to say that Me Too participates in an era of post-truth. According to Ben Venice, personal pronouns as self-referential signs can't be used incorrectly. He says they are not subject to the conditions of truth and escape denial. But that's not Jakobson's view, particularly in relation to the third person plural we, which he describes as both a shifter and a non-shifter. For Jakobson, we is a non-shifter insofar as it conveys some information, both as to category of person, gender, and information as to category of number, more than one. And it's interesting then to think about the use of the third person plural, they, to indicate a single person of fluid, non-binary or transgender. And to think about that, I want to introduce the idea that the category of number involved in Me Too and in they is a distributive number. This is a term that I draw from Adrian Mackenzie, who says that these are numbers that emerged from the sequenced association of probability distributions in complex statistical techniques such as MC, Markov chain Monte Carlo simulation. He says that while MC is designed to singularize or individualize entities, the aim is to describe entities or events that are neither identical to nor independent of each other. That is, the aim is to describe entities that are essentially interrelated. MC does this, he says, by individuating an entity, by calculating how more or less similar the entity is to others in probabilistic terms. And as a result, the individual identity or event is identified as a joint probability distribution within different intersecting populations. So in this arithmetic, a 1 is understood in terms of many manys. In this arithmetic, 1 is not held to be identical with or independent of other ones. Instead, 1 is an ensemble. And he has this fantastic quote here where he is arguing that individuals are now distributed across populations of different kinds that intersect through them. He says individuals, or ones in my terms, become more like populations or crowds. And it's as an example of a personal pronoun that is the outcome of distributive numbering, I want to suggest that the hashtag #MeToo has the capacity to refute Benveniste's claim that I cannot not be speaking of myself. As a distributive number, #MeToo is simultaneously one and many, not as the addition of either unique independent ones or the addition of equivalent ones, but as a conjoint entity, a condividual. It's perhaps also an instance of free indirect discourse, the personal and impersonal perspective of a probabilistic and participatory practice of statistical conjoining. And it's perhaps because the referent whole of #MeToo is vague that it provokes the emergence of competing totals or wholes as references, including not only not me too and him too, but not all men, yes, all women, all those that I mentioned before. And I think it's also what makes Black Lives Matter a total or whole that is both bigger and smaller than all lives matter. So I'm going to sum up. I know I've gone on. I've tried to show in all these examples how one and many are related, but also to show the differences in how they did this. I tried to show the importance of the relations between participating in and being part of, and how that's calculated. And I've tried to address whether the figures that are created are proper or improper persons. But perhaps what I've tried to draw out for the conference is that while the political arithmetic of personalisation undoubtedly involves quantification, this is an arithmetic that doesn't assume that every one is the same size or is independent of other ones. Instead, I'm suggesting in the political arithmetic of personalisation, one does not only have relations with other ones, but is a relation. One is a relation. It's not a standalone unit for additive operations, but an entity with relations of similarity integrally implied. It's continually remade in the looping practices of participation in which platforms calculate distributions of one and many. Quickly returning to Althusser, I'm going to suggest that we no longer need to do an about turn of 180 degrees. We look at the screen. The screen says, hey you. The ideology of personalism might be that we believe that you can do you. You do you. But it's also possible when you look in the screen that you can see a they that is or are approximately similar to, but not the same as other simultaneously singular and plural theys. And I end with a quote from Ray Chow, which speaks to these more general shifts, which I hope I have given some indication of, and apologies for taking so much time. That is the end.